Hey, thanks, Mumbi. I'm actually going to pass it to my colleague Lise, who's going to kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Pegah. And hi, everyone. I'm Lise Townsend. I've kind of parachuted into Surrey to help advance the climate action strategy. And I formerly worked for the city of Burnaby for almost 10 years, leading sustainability and climate action there. So I'll just jump in here, and Pegah's going to provide most of the context on the equity, but I'll just give a bit of an overview of where we're at in our climate action strategy. So yes. Oh, so Pegah, sorry. Do you want to? Should I speak to this one as well?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, just to provide a little bit of Surrey context. So yeah, we are located on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Katsi, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo land-based nations. We have a fairly significant population, being the second largest city in BC, and quite rapid growth and development. And there's a few other statistics for you there as well. So fairly large land base. We've got a pretty significant agricultural land, but also some quite dense urban areas, and a real evolution, I would say, for context, just as a former suburb of Vancouver and really evolving into a city in its own rights. And of course, some growing pains along the way there, and a very diverse population, and as noted, largely on the younger side. So for our climate context, in 2019 was when Council declared a climate emergency, and in March 2020 adopted targets to achieve citywide net zero GHG emissions before 2050, and corporate absolute zero GHG emissions before 2050. So as you might guess, the distinction being that on the corporate side, we plan to eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions rather than doing any offsetting in order to demonstrate leadership. And so currently we're working on that report that adopted those targets also directed staff to update our climate action strategy to develop a roadmap to achieve those targets. And that's what we're in the process of doing now. So where we're at is over the past year, we've been working on GHG modeling, updating our inventory, looking at scenarios, and developing a framework, and also starting to do internal engagement. And so we're now at a stage where we have a draft framework, and so we're just about to advance a corporate report to go then launch public engagement over the summer, with the plan being to have a draft plan approved by the end of this year. So we'll see if we stick to that. I sense it might spill over into early next year, but we're shooting for completion this year. So this just shows where our emissions come from. I won't go into this in detail, but like most communities, transportation and buildings are the two largest sources. So on-road transportation, 46%, and buildings, 40% of our emissions. Okay, next slide. So our framework consists of 5 branches that we're calling them. And I'll just briefly walk you through what each of those entails, with a little bit of some of the equity considerations, and just going to briefly touch on these so that we can get into the more details. And just to let you know that we're going to be sharing in our public engagement some of the vision statements, some of the key strategies and actions needed to achieve our targets in each of these branches, and also some equity considerations. So that is going to be part of our public engagement process. So the first one is resilient zero carbon neighborhoods. And Pegah, I'm just going to go quickly from these ones into the following slides. So this one really, so if you want to just go ahead, I'll just give the brief overview. So this one really talks about, like, the key concept is really this 15-minute city concept, where we really want to shift our land use so that we have more walkable neighborhoods that are connected with transit and active transportation. So this is going to require things like updating our OCP and our zoning bylaw. And then some of the key equity considerations with this, as shown on the next slide, are things like managing displacement and gentrification, considering affordable housing as areas redevelop, so things like affordable housing policies and tenant protection policies. Those are just some examples. By no means is it comprehensive. The next one is safe zero carbon transportation. And we have already adopted an electric vehicle policy, and as we have our provincial zero emissions vehicle mandate. So this one really, so that's considered to be more or less baked now. So this one really focuses more on prioritizing walking, cycling, and transit, which of course has many co-benefits, and which in and of themselves are really important for equity. And so some of the other equity considerations would be providing more equitable access to transit across different neighborhoods of the city, ensuring that people feel safe, so that vulnerable and marginalized people have a better experience of personal safety on our streets, and just generally shifting away from a car-centric to a people-centric approach, and ensuring accessibility when we do our upgrades and active transportation infrastructure. Healthy zero carbon buildings. So that really focuses very strongly on building electrification and improving the indoor air quality in our buildings. You can flip to the next one if you can, Pegah. What else? Yeah, and also improving resilience. So things like, yeah, improving indoor air quality and filtration of wildfire smoke, etc. But largely we need to decarbonize our existing and our new construction. And so some of the equity considerations are, of course, energy poverty. The health impacts of gas cooking, I think, is a really kind of under-recognized hazard that disproportionately affects vulnerable and people with lower incomes. And of course, we know that people who are renting and have lower incomes have lower agency and capital to retrofit their homes. And then lastly is the topic, oh, not quite lastly, the climate positive resilient ecosystems. So we're, of course, focusing on restoring and enhancing our ecosystems. And that includes both, if you can flip to the next one, if you can, Pegah, both protecting our existing ecosystems and building green infrastructure throughout the city. And some of the equity considerations for that will be, ensuring that neighborhoods that currently are underrepresented with green space and access to nature has more equitable access. And can you just flip to the next slide for me, Pegah? Thanks. And also just recognizing that really there are a lot of different cultural views on what the environment means to people, and other factors such as vulnerability to urban heat. And lastly, both city leadership. This really is a broad category focusing on the city's own infrastructure and assets, but also on how we engage with the community. And so this one, as shown on the next slide, has some aspects where we're trying to center climate action in our decision making, as well as equitable climate action. So improving inclusion for marginalized and vulnerable residents, and really making equity a core consideration. So with that, I will pass it back to Pegah.
Thanks, Lise. Sorry, everyone. I'm having some slow computer problems with flipping slides, so that's where I was falling short. So as you all know, climate change impacts everyone, and as Lise has presented to us to this point, this is a big undertaking to meet this greenhouse gas reduction target for the community. We've got our work cut out for us. And we also wanted to recognize through this work that not all communities are positioned equally with the burdens and benefits of climate change. And that historically low-income communities, Indigenous communities, racialized communities, and other marginalized communities have been overlooked by climate programs, underrepresented in decision-making, and underserved as a result. So the creative question that our team was working on with, given the fact that we have to update our climate change action strategy and the recognition that equity is a critical component of that was, how can Surrey's sustainability team center equity in its approach to climate action moving forward, and not just for this plan, but in all the work that we do in the name of climate action. So our conclusion was to utilize the funding from CUSP's LEAP program, BC Hydro, and some city funding to create an equity in climate action toolkit. I do want to emphasize that, like Saskatoon, our toolkit is was exclusively designed for our office and not something that we think that the city will adopt right away, perhaps in the future after we've tested it out a few times with multiple projects. So the first thing we wanted to do was to really define what we meant by equity. As you all might be aware, equity is becoming a priority for many, and having a definition to really center our work around was critical to this. So we decided to go with the USDN's definition for equity that they've used, which encompasses procedural equity, distributional equity, structural equity, and transgenerational equity. So without going into too much detail on each of these pieces, procedural is, are we engaging the community are we hearing from the community in the decisions we're making? Distributional is, are we making sure that our programs and policies are resulting in a fair distribution of benefits and burdens across all segments of the community? And if not, how are we prioritizing those with the highest need? Structural is, do we have the courage to go back to our previous policies and programs and to actually critique our work and say, okay, how is this perpetuating inequity, and are we willing to shift that? And finally, transgenerational. As we look at, the policies and programs we're going to put in place today, how is that going to impact future generations? And making sure that that's central into the decisions that we're making. Our initial approach with this work last summer was, okay, great. We'll do a best practices review based on what other cities have done at the Surrey context, finalize the toolkit, and then we'll run with it. But soon, after discussions with equity professionals, including Mumbi, who's on the call today, Allison, Desiree, William, Raji, and Udo Kam from the city of Vancouver, we realized that in order to create an equity toolkit, we really had to do this in-depth approach, which involved building awareness among our staff as to how equity and climate action intersect, to go and listen to the community in terms of what we've done to date and how we can make that better, thinking about climate action equity, supporting staff learning beyond just the delivery of the toolkit, testing this toolkit, and then modifying the toolkit on an ongoing basis to make sure that we are up to date in the best way possible to integrate equity in climate action. So in the first step, what we did was we created a series of spatial representations on indicators related to equity and climate action. We really honed in on the work that CUSP had done through the Energy Poverty Toolkit, but also looked at areas in which we had the data and other municipalities were creating displaying other relationships that exist between equity and climate action. So we created a set of beta maps. We haven't released that yet because they're still in the work, but we created a bunch of maps that we then used to engage the community and to engage our colleagues in the topic around equity and climate action. We went out to the community and invited feedback. And as Hillary mentioned, what the initial feedback we received was, we are in the middle of COVID-19 and we don't have the capacity to discuss about your equity toolkit. So our pivot, or what we pivoted to, was to actually engage frontline community organizations that work very closely with these folks to develop a set of recommendations that went right into our toolkit. So some key takeaways from this was, moving at the speed of trust rather than at the speed of our timelines, building ownership of projects or policies, programs within the community, and to also show appreciation for participants through honorariums and other ways of recognizing the community. We held a set of 3 staff workshops that we did hand in hand with our equity toolkit. In the first one, we really looked at our power as individuals within the system of the city, and what power we have in shifting decisions, and what power we don't have, and our relationship to the community. And in the second and third workshops, we actually tested portions of the toolkit with specific examples, such as land use planning and transportation. So here's a very quick example from one of our workshops with city staff. We had a hypothetical situation of, okay, let's say the city wants to transition to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2050, then that would mean that the city would be investing in charging stations. That was our assumption. And what we did was we actually filtered this assumption, or this goal, through the 4 dimensions of equity and where we are at today, to understand what are the gaps, what are the opportunities. So for example, doing this simple exercise made us realize that our current approach to charging stations to date has left this huge gap right here, where you see in West Newton, which also happens to be a community that is low income, and many of whom are from our newcomers to Canada. So this was just one way of showing that already there's this discrepancy happening, and we need to use these maps, use our training in the toolkit to address these opportunities. So where we're at right now is the toolkit. Allison sent me a quick message to share the link to the toolkit, and we are not done with it yet. It's still in the works, and I promise as soon as it's done, I will share it with everybody on the call if you're interested. And we will be applying this toolkit with our CCAS engagement, which we'll be launching in the next couple of weeks with the community. And once we finalize our toolkit and it's approved by council, we plan to go back to the toolkit and to make sure that all the lessons learned are applied to the toolkit, and that the toolkit is updated on a regular basis. So final slide here before I go to questions and answers. I did want to just share some lessons from our experience with working on this project. And of course, with our consultant resilience planning, what we heard was that climate change is not of immediate concern to our community at the moment, specifically because of COVID-19, and that there are other pressing issues. So it's actually the responsibility of city staff, our sustainability staff, to consider the 4 dimensions of equity and to shape our engagement in a way that brings the community to the table, and for us to go to the community, to their table, and meet them where they're at. And finally, I do want to mention that this toolkit that we are developing is simply a guide, that this involves ongoing learning and commitment by staff in order to really achieve that systemic change needed to fully integrate equity into climate action. So with that, I want to say thank you, and just pass it to Mumbi for the question period. Thank you.
Yes, thank you